That update. Right now, we want to continue this conversation further with more developments that have just come in the last hour. I want Hal Kempfer, national security expert, to react to some of them. Hal, thanks for being with us yet again tonight. A major development we just got in about 30 minutes ago, confirmed by the Associated Press. I'm going to put up a tweet for our viewers from Fox News correspondent Lucas Tomlinson with a picture of Major General Andrei Sukovetsky, the commanding general of the Russian 7th Airborne Division, killed in Ukraine. That's being confirmed by the Associated Press and Fox News. Significant battle loss for the Russian army. What say you about this? What does this mean?
Andrew, it's significant because he's commanding general of an airborne division, which is one of the more elite divisions, but he's also the deputy commander of the 41st Combined Arms Army, basically the CAA, a huge group which is north of Kyiv. And I think that's pretty big. You know, you saw the 40-mile parking lot along the hardball roads north of Kyiv. All reports out there are that the Ukraine forces are having some pretty good success with some ambushes, if you will, some raids going in there. They have not been decisively engaged. And I think that's the strategy of Ukraine, is to avoid decisive engagement. But they've been inflicting casualties on that force where the morale is horrible. There's a lot of surrendering of Russian forces. There's reported desertions. There's reports that they've been sabotaging their own vehicles so they don't have to move. They've been running out of fuel. They didn't have enough food. And now their elite deputy commander of that whole group up there was just killed. I think that has a combined effect. I wouldn't be surprised if that convoy, as they're calling it, has a tougher time moving as they try to figure out their command and control and some other things. Obviously, in a military organization, there's somebody right there to step in, but that's a big loss.
Hal, I want to stay on this convoy that's outside of Kyiv right now, because I'm getting a lot of questions from family, from friends, even coworkers. Why can't the Ukrainian, air power take this convoy out? Why can't NATO and the U.S. do something about this convoy that is a sitting duck, if you will? Explain to our viewers why the U.S. and NATO cannot touch that.
Well, for the U.S. or NATO to go in there and attack that convoy would be to go in direct military conflict with Russia. If we go in direct military conflict with Russia, we just kicked off World War III with the second largest nuclear arms power in the world. A nuclear arms power that has not been quiet in recent days and weeks about making sure we remember the fact that they have this capability. So we don't want to do that. I mean, look, what's happening in Ukraine is horrible. A nuclear Armageddon across the planet is worse. So what we're doing is we're trying to provide as much resources, aid as we can without tripping into a third world war. And if you look at the history of warfare, particularly World War I, it is so easy to get into wars, so tough to get out of them. And a lot of times, just proximity of forces can cause events that weren't intended to kind of escalate. And the next thing you know, you have a full-armed conflict. And frankly, the strategic weapons on both sides are just something that we can never use.
So in your view, I guess, militarily and philosophically, the strategy of escalate to de-escalate is not prudent, or maybe does not work, or is not an option.
I hear a lot of armchair sort of, maybe we should put a no-fly zone over there. It's one thing to put a no-fly zone over northern and southern Iraq. I mean, what's Iraq going to do, honestly, all right? You put a no-fly zone over there, you're in. There's no way to get out of it. By the way, that goes to something we'll talk about in a bit, those humanitarian corridors. If you have corridors that you're flying over, you're not permitting them to fly, but you are protecting the shipment of arms to their forces. In fact, you're indirectly potentially protecting their ability to fly offensive military operations against Russian forces. you're into an escalatory pattern, and you're really parsing words to say that we're not in that conflict. So that's why we're backing all the way off and saying, look, NATO is the line, but we will do all these other things.
You know, Hal, though, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, he held a press conference with members of the Western media today, and he reiterated and reemphasized to European allies in the United States that he really is stressing the need for a no-fly zone. He said he didn't know how long Ukraine could hold out against Russian forces. I mean, that's to be expected from the Ukrainian leader, but he has not let go of that prospect.
I think he hopes that it would happen. It would, obviously, from a Ukraine government standpoint, from a Ukraine standpoint, they would like to see NATO and the Western powers roll in on their side. They would love to see a no-fly zone. I'm sure they would love to see some armored divisions rolling in north of Kyiv to stop this from happening. But once we go in like that, or any NATO power goes in like that, it's just, you're parsing words to say that this won't escalate. And frankly, those aren't words that will be parsed in the Kremlin. And that's the bottom line. If Russia feels that we have entered a conflict, then we have entered the conflict.
Yeah.
And the threat of strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, cannot be underestimated. I mean, I'm a cold warrior. We lived under this forever. All right. And we knew why we didn't do certain things that could have been done because of that umbrella that encompasses the world. We can't do it. And we don't have enough defensive weapons to knock out all the missiles that can be fired. I mean, there's been some improvements, but it's just there is no anti-missile umbrella system that protects the United States or protects Europe. If it goes to that, we will be losing cities, countries, civilization. It's bad, but it's there are lines.
Hal, to that point, that was another development today. The United States and Russia creating a military communication line to prevent accidental escalation. So to your point, this is on the minds of both American and Russian officials in order to not make a grave mistake. Hal, I just want to move on to another major development we got in the last hour as well. I'm going to put up this tweet from an Associated Press reporter with the latest filing. A plant spokesman says Russian troops have begun shelling Europe's largest nuclear power station in Ukraine. I just want to read more information. This is the biggest nuclear power plant in Ukraine, one of the biggest in Europe. The plant manager is reporting that it's been shelled by Russian forces over the past few hours. It's on fire. According to U.S. officials who are aware of the facility, there are 6 nuclear blocks there. Now, in Chernobyl, there was only one, and it was much smaller than each of these. The International Atomic Energy Agency, that is their mandate to kind of monitor all of these stations, said in a statement that indeed it has confirmed that it is getting shelled. The IAEA has warned about the fighting around this facility, and now we know it is on fire. How worried should we be about this development?
Well, I would be very concerned. Hopefully they're going to shut down procedures, or they've done shut down procedures to shut down the entire plant. But, that was always a fear. In fact, as we were kind of looking at this whole what could happen thing before the invasion began, the concern was that Chernobyl was one of I think 4 or 5 nuclear facilities that had to be looked at throughout Ukraine. And this obviously is the biggest one. The fear is they get in there and frankly, the troops just don't know. And it's not that they're going to necessarily, they have the weapons to potentially, breach the containment sphere, or the containment vessel, I should say, for the plant, but they could also take out all these other things around it. Don't forget what happened in Fukushima. What happened was a wave came in and it took out all the other things around it that were needed to shut down the plant. And that's what caused the meltdown to occur, was that all the other stuff had been flooded, taken out, and therefore all these fail-safe mechanisms didn't work. that's my concern with this, is that the shelling, the fighting, the displacement of key personnel who need to be there to go through the procedures could lead to a situation where all the things around it, the fail-safe stuff, doesn't work because there's nobody there to do it, or it got inadvertently taken out in the fighting.
All right, Hal, I want you to respond as well, and I want your opinion on if this is, a sense of optimism. We learned earlier today that a meeting on both sides, from both the Ukrainians and Russians, agreed preliminarily to humanitarian corridors and potential ceasefires in areas where civilians need to get out. Should we be optimistic about this? And if so, do you think it'll hold?
Well, I thought it was a very positive development. You know, you have a lot of civilians who are really stuck in these urban areas. You know, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and soon Odessa will be stuck in that area. And the big problem is, how do you get the civilians out, to get them out of that combat zone safely? The other thing is, how do you get aid in to help them? That's going to be the tougher one. I think the evacuation, going one direction, getting people out, that's something that could be probably monitored and done. I think where the Russians are going to really be sticklers is on what can come into these cities. And I think that's going to be a further negotiating point. In principle, it can be done. But, you know, the concern they would have is, will lethal aid be snuck in with non-lethal aid? And then again, if you have food and other materials going into the city where there are resistance fighters, it's basically you're opening up a logistic supply line for the resistance fighters from the Russian perspective. And you're enabling them to resist longer. So there's a lot of details that have to be worked out on something like this.
All right, Hal Kempfer, we're at the top of the hour. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about some of these other diplomatic developments, also what's going on with the Russian economy, more sanctions being put in place on many Russian oligarchs. So we have all that and more in 2 minutes. Hal, stick with us. Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. That's a Live Now look at the White House. We are learning as well, President Biden hosting a meeting with the leader of Finland tomorrow there at the White House, so that will be highly watched. Finland has been kind of a sideline player to all of this. There's been talk about possible NATO membership as they have watched the Russian war into Ukraine. I'm being joined yet again by national security expert Hal Kempfer with all the latest. Hal, good to see you. You know, diplomatically speaking, I wanted to get that on everyone's radar. Also, what we are also watching for is, at least this was concerning to me today, this call between French leader Macron and Putin. Now, reports are saying is Putin dialed up Macron first. He requested, and then from reports of what the call essentially said was Putin is going full speed ahead. He has no intention of backing down from his directives and from his initiatives, essentially that he's going full bore to capture Ukraine. This call was very concerning. Putin's not letting up anytime soon.
No, he's not. In fact, it looks like they're just going to keep pushing. I think he's pushing beyond the capability of their military forces to really follow his plan. I think he's isolated himself, and this has happened historically with various leaders. Hitler's a very famous example. Certainly prior to World War II, Stalin would be another example where they insulate themselves, where they kind of live in their own bubble. It's a reinforcement of whatever they believe and whatever they say. They have absolute control. And it certainly appears that Putin may have put himself in such a bubble that he's just not quite grasping either what's going on the ground or quite possibly he just puts it into a different interpretation of what's going on the ground. But the math is real simple. Russia doesn't have sizable enough forces to occupy and control Ukraine. It's too big. It's the size of Texas. There's just no way to do it. Even Kherson, the city that they overran or they took over yesterday, there was some discussion today about what will the Russians maintain in that city. And it was interesting that the Ukraine military forces had pulled out. Unfortunately, some of the volunteers that had joined up to do stuff tried to fight off the Russian forces coming into the city, which, as I understand, they're coming into the city basically when the mayor went out to greet them. They went out to fight the Russian forces, and they were basically taken out by the Russian forces. They tried to go after them with Molotov cocktails and light arms, but the Ukrainian military had actually pulled back, and I think, you know, with that whole economy of force way that they're sort of thinking, that they know that, okay, we will trade urban terrain for Russian casualties. They'll come in and take the city, but at some point they have to move those forces forward to go after Odessa. And when there's a lightly armed force left there or no force left there, they can literally go back into the city and cut off those lines of communication supporting the forces forward in Odessa. So there's some interesting possibilities in terms of the battle space of what the Ukrainians will do, won't do, and how they're doing it.
Yeah, and of course, Hal, let's get to the brewing confrontation now with Odessa. That's going to be happening. Some type of amphibious assault is in the offing here. And Odessa is on the Black Sea, and it's a huge population center. So far, it hasn't really been touched yet by this war, but do you think it soon will be?
I think it will be. I'm kind of curious as to where the landing beaches will be or how they plan to insert those amphibious forces otherwise. One of the interesting things is you've heard a lot about the Javelin missiles that we've been sending in there. One of the uses of Javelin missiles, I know we trained for this, the British have trained for this as well, but one of the uses is to repel an amphibious force. You can sit on the shoreline. It's got a lot of length or a lot of range. I don't know if they have the newest ones, but the newest ones will reach out about 4,700 meters, about 4.5 kilometers. The ones they probably have about 2.5 kilometers, but that's still a bit of range. You know, so if someone's coming out, in landing craft or whatever, that's enough range that you could cause a lot of damage for the landing force with not that many Javelin missiles. You can imagine what Javelin missiles would have done on Normandy to our forces if the Germans had had them, and you can kind of put that in reverse to see what could happen here. So I think that if they are there, and the reason I say that is because the internal lines of communication for the Ukraine army or Ukraine military in terms of moving things from Poland, where this stuff is, and Romania, where this stuff is coming in, to where they can deploy it. That's a lot easier move than trying to go all the way across the Ukraine to Kyiv or further out to Kharkiv. So I think that there might be some of these systems down there that they could employ against a potential amphibious assault. The other thing too with the Javelin, there is a mode you can set on it. And so if the amphibious assault's using helicopters, it's not the greatest weapon for it, but you can actually use it as an anti-aircraft weapon against helicopters. And it's got some range out there. So.
Hal, I want to move away, kind of militarily speaking, about where this conflict is going to be going now, almost into its 9th day. But let's get back to what's going on in Russia. We also heard from not only Vladimir Putin today, we heard from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He said, in Kharkiv, there are no Russian troops. You like the word murderer. Kyiv regime, those are real murderers. Zelensky, yes, he is a Nazi and a neo-Nazi because he's on their side. Why are they sticking with this pretext that the Jewish leader of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a neo-Nazi?
It's just the narrative, and I don't mean to say that I can read Putin's mind, because I absolutely cannot. But within the Stalinesque framework, they look back at what happened in World War II when the Nazis came into the Ukraine, and Ukrainian nationals or Ukrainian residents who were there, many of them collaborated openly with the Germans. Now, in historical context, we look at that and we think it's absolutely horrendous. And certainly, when we look at the Holocaust and all of that, it's horrendous as well. But the reason there was some rationale behind it was because Stalin had engaged in some of the most brutal tactics you can imagine to crush Ukrainian nationalism, to include starving the Ukrainian population, literally killing off a large percentage of the Ukrainian population through starvation. So they were happy to see pretty much anybody coming in that was going against Stalin. That seems to be sticking in Putin's mind, and I think that's why he keeps referring to the Nazi thing, was at World War II. He also, look, are there neo-Nazis, or I should say, yeah, somewhat neo-Nazis within Ukrainian politics? There are, all right? It's very disturbing. They have a political presence. They're not a dominant political presence by any means, but they are there, all right? And I think that he's over-exaggerating that presence as well.
Hal, I also wanted to get your opinion too, because we learned today from Vladimir Zelensky in his press conference that now about 16,000 foreign fighters have come in or are coming into Ukraine to assist with the war effort, because they've opened up this fight to foreigners. Is that customary in wars and conflicts like this, where we see men and women from all over the world come to aid the Ukrainians?
Well, Andrew, we've seen it before. In fact, we saw it on the other side in Iraq. When I was over there, one of the problems we were dealing with was what we call foreign fighters. They were motivated by Al-Qaeda, by their philosophy, doctrine, everything that they were talking about, and they would come over and they would fight against the United States and our allies over there supporting the Iraqi government. The same phenomena happened over in Afghanistan, not just to us, but it actually happened to the Soviet Union. They had that issue going back. If you want to go back further, you can go back to Spain during their civil war in the 1930s. Very famously, there was a couple of brigades that were largely manned by Americans and some other Europeans. They weren't successful, but they were fighting the fascists, fighting Franco. So that does happen. What the concern that we have here in the U.S. With that is who's going over to fight. And there would be a slight concern, obviously, if there were extremist elements here that were going over to fight in that war to pick up tactics, techniques, procedures, capabilities with some idea that they want to bring it back here. And that's something that we just have to look at. That's why, generally speaking, we don't encourage American citizens to go join foreign armies, and we kind of prohibit them from becoming mercenaries, if you will, in a strict use of that term. But it's amazing how many people just so far. And think about this: how far are we into this? 1 week, 16,000 in 1 week. Where are we going to be in 1 month?
Right. Plus a million refugees.
A million. Well, it's a million refugees. You got 16,000 foreign fighters. I'm just doing the math as to where we're going to be 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now. You know, potentially we could see 5 million refugees, depending on what happens coming out of there. That's been projected. Yeah. But I also think we might see a lot more foreign fighters going in as well, and that could be significant.
All right, Hal Kempfer, we got to leave it at that. We appreciate your time and your insight into all of this and helping us make sense of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. We'll be talking yet again probably tomorrow, Hal. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, right now we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we do have new video out of that power plant in Ukraine. We're working on getting that for you, but like we were reporting, Russian troops have begun shelling Europe's largest nuclear power station in Ukraine. This plant is in a city on the Dnieper River that accounts for 1/4 of the country's power generation. And so we'll have that in 2 minutes.